July 11th, 1944, 0630 hours, Hill 117 outside Caen, France. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his eye to the periscope of his Panzer IV and counted what should have been impossible. 17 Sherman tanks advancing in perfect formation across the Norman countryside. His heart sank as he whispered to his gunner, "Mein Gott, there are more of them than we have shells." Here's the twist everyone gets wrong about the Sherman tank. It wasn't inferior, it was a mathematical weapon designed to win through sheer overwhelming presence. Stay for the moment. German tankers realized they weren't fighting tanks, they were fighting American industry itself. What Zimmermann didn't know was that those 17 Shermans represented just 0.00034% of America's total production. The mathematics of industrial warfare were already written in Detroit's assembly lines, where a Sherman rolled off the production floor every 47 minutes. This wasn't a tank battle, it was an avalanche. The Sherman M4A3E8 Easy 8 represented American pragmatism distilled into 33 tons of rolled steel. While Germans obsessed over the perfect tank, Americans had created something unprecedented, a good enough tank in impossible quantities. Here's what's insane about this. America built more Sherman tanks in 1943 alone than Germany produced of all tank types during the entire war. Among the 2,400 German tankers positioned across Normandy that morning were men who would witness the death of Panzer doctrine. But on July 11th, they were just soldiers who'd been told American tanks were Ronsons, machines that lit up with one match. Klaus Zimmermann had 3 kills painted on his turret and believed every word. This story reveals how quantity defeated quality, and how German confidence turned to desperate mathematics when they discovered what American industrial might could really do. But wait till you see what happened when those Sherman crews started talking back. Klaus Zimmermann had seen impossible things before. At Kursk, he'd watched T-34 appear like ghosts from the wheat fields. But this was different. Through his commander's cupola, stretched across 3 kilometers of Norman hedgerow, was a sight that broke every calculation he'd been taught about American tank production. "Hans," he called to his driver. "Count the Shermans on the left flank." Seconds passed. "I count 12, Herr Obergefreiter." "And the center?" 15. "The right?" Silence. Then "Mein Gott, 23. 50 American tanks in a single field of view. Zimmermann's training manual stated that an entire American armored division contained 168 tanks. His eyes were telling him that nearly 1/3 of an entire division was advancing on his single position. The mathematics were impossible, unless everything they'd been told about American production was catastrophically wrong. The radio crackled. Achtung, multiple Sherman formations, grid 314, 892, grid 318, 897, grid 322, 901. The reports kept coming, different units, different positions, all reporting the same impossible sight, dozens of Shermans where there should have been none. What Zimmermann couldn't know was that he was witnessing the result of the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. While his Panzer IV had been handcrafted by skilled workers over several weeks, each Sherman facing him had been assembled in exactly 10.5 hours by workers who'd never seen a tank before Pearl Harbor. His commander's voice cut through the radio static. "All units, prepare for contact. We are heavily outnumbered, but remember, American tanks are inferior. 1 Panzer IV equals 3 Shermans." Klaus gripped his periscope handles and watched 50 inferior tanks begin their advance. But this was just the beginning. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann wasn't just any Panzer crewman. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a survivor of Stalingrad's cauldron, and holder of the Iron Cross Second Class, for knocking out 7 Soviet tanks in a single engagement near Kharkov. His crew had served together for 18 months, an eternity in panzer warfare. At 24, he was practically ancient by tank crew standards. 3 weeks earlier, Klaus had written to his wife Maria, in Bavaria. "The Americans bring good cigarettes and chocolate, but their tanks are jokes, tall, poorly armored, and they burn like haystacks. Our intelligence says they call them Ronsons themselves. Lights first time every time. Don't worry about me, Liebchen. The war in the West will be easier than Russia." Klaus believed this because every piece of intelligence, every briefing, every conversation with transferred veterans reinforced the same narrative. American tanks were mass-produced garbage, quantity over quality, industrial muscle flexing, but no real fighting capability. His gunner, Hans Weber, had served in North Africa. In Tunisia, Hans would tell anyone who'd listen, "We watched Shermans brew up from single shots. Their ammunition storage is criminal. Stacked right in the hull, one penetration, and whoosh, human torch." The crew's loader, young Friedrich, barely 18, had joined them after Kursk. He'd never faced Americans, but he'd heard the stories. "They say American tankers get ice cream rations." He'd joke, "What kind of soldiers worry about ice cream in a war?" Even their division commander, Oberst Heinrich Eberbach, had briefed them with supreme confidence. "The Sherman is a proof of American industrial might. Yes, but it's also proof of their tactical ignorance. They've built 30,000 mobile coffins." Klaus adjusted his throat microphone and studied the advancing Shermans through his optics. Easy targets, high silhouettes, predictable tactics. Everything he'd been taught suggested this would be a turkey shoot. What none of them understood was that American inferiority was actually sophisticated design philosophy. The Sherman wasn't built to be the perfect tank. It was built to be the perfect system. Here's what Klaus Zimmermann was actually facing: the M4A3E8 Sherman Easy 8, 33 tons of American engineering genius, disguised as simplicity. While German engineers obsessed over perfect armor angles and maximum firepower, American designers had solved a completely different problem. How do you win a tank war on 3 continents simultaneously? The answer was revolutionary. The Sherman's 76 mm M1A2 gun could penetrate 109 mm of armor at 500 yards, more than enough to kill any German tank, except the Tiger II. Its Ford GAA V8 engine, borrowed from aircraft production, generated 500 horsepower, and could be completely swapped out in 4 hours by a field maintenance crew. The transmission was foolproof. The tracks were interchangeable. Every component was designed for one thing: keep fighting. But here's the engineering miracle Klaus couldn't see: interchangeability. Every Sherman part could fit every other Sherman. A track link from a tank built in Detroit could replace one on a tank built in California. An engine from March could drop into a hull from December. The Americans hadn't just built a tank, they'd built a system. The vertical volute spring suspension that German tankers mocked as primitive actually provided superior crew comfort over long distances. While Panzer crews arrived at battle exhausted from brutal rides, Sherman crews arrived fresh and alert. The high silhouette that seemed like a design flaw, it provided superior gun depression, allowing Shermans to fight hull down from positions where German tanks couldn't even engage. The real genius was in the production numbers. Chrysler's tank arsenal in Detroit had perfected assembly line tank production. Workers who'd built cars before the war now built tanks using the same techniques Henry Ford had pioneered. A Sherman tank required 55,000 individual parts. Chrysler could assemble those parts into a combat-ready tank in exactly 10.5 hours. Every week, American factories delivered 140 new Sherman tanks to the war effort. Every single week. While Klaus Zimmermann's Panzer IV had been hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen over several weeks, the Shermans facing him had rolled off production lines faster than Germany could train replacement crews. This wasn't just engineering, it was industrial warfare, and Klaus was about to learn the difference. The radio reports kept flooding in, and Klaus Zimmermann began doing mathematics that broke his understanding of warfare. His battalion had started with 42 tanks. After 3 weeks of fighting, they were down to 16 operational vehicles, normal attrition, expected losses. But the Americans? Every dawn brought more Shermans than the previous day. "Bruno 6, this is Bruno 2, crackled through his headset. "I count 37 enemy tanks advancing on Hill 109. Bruno 6 was his company commander, Major Wilhelm Baeke, a Knight's Cross holder who'd destroyed over 60 Soviet tanks. "Bruno 2, confirm count. 37 seems excessive." "Confirmed, sir. 37 Shermans, various marks. They're advancing in company formation." Klaus switched frequencies and heard similar reports across the entire front. Second company reported 42 Shermans. Third company spotted 28. The Americans weren't just replacing their losses, they were multiplying. Here's what Klaus couldn't comprehend. While his division had received 4 replacement tanks in 3 weeks, American armored divisions received complete equipment refreshers. Tank crews would wake up to find their destroyed Sherman from yesterday replaced by 2 new ones, with full ammunition loads, and fresh crews trained in Georgia and Louisiana. The mathematics were staggering. Germany's total tank production in 1944 would reach 17,328 vehicles of all types: Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tigers, tank destroyers, assault guns. Every single vehicle Germany would produce that entire year. America had already built 17,565 Sherman tanks by January 1944. Just Shermans. Just in 6 months, they were still building them at full pace, plus Stuart light tanks, plus tank destroyers, plus half-tracks, plus all the other armored vehicles Klaus couldn't even identify in the distance. But here's the number that would have broken Klaus's spirit. 49,234. That's how many Sherman tanks America would eventually produce. More than Germany's entire pre-war army, rolling off assembly lines faster than Germany could train crews to fight them. A single American tank battalion lost 12 Shermans on Tuesday and received 18 replacements on Wednesday. Klaus's entire division had been waiting 3 months for spare parts. The radio crackled again. All units. Enemy armor, advancing in battalion strength. Battalion strength. Klaus looked through his periscope at what appeared to be an entire armored regiment and whispered, "If this is battalion strength, what does regiment strength look like?" The numbers were staggering, but the human cost was even more shocking. Klaus Zimmermann's fuel gauge read 1/4 full. It had read 1/4 full for 6 days because there was no fuel to add. His ammunition rack contained 17 armor-piercing rounds and 8 high-explosive shells, 25 rounds total for what looked like a battle against 50 enemy tanks. The mathematics of resource warfare were becoming clear, and they were brutal. His radio operator, Dietrich, had been monitoring American communications. "Herr Obergefreiter," he whispered. "The Americans are discussing lunch plans on open channels. They're arguing about whether to have the turkey or the beef." Klaus stared at him. "What?" "They have a choice of meals, sir. Hot meals. And they're complaining that yesterday's ice cream was vanilla instead of chocolate." While Klaus's crew had shared a single can of ersatz meat for breakfast, American tank crews were debating menu options. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't desperate soldiers fighting for survival. They were well-fed professionals doing a job. The German supply situation had collapsed completely. Klaus's division was supposed to receive 200 tons of supplies daily. They were receiving 30 tons on good days. Nothing on bad days. American divisions received 650 tons of supplies daily and considered that barely adequate. German tank crews were abandoning perfectly functional vehicles because they couldn't get fuel or ammunition. Klaus knew of 3 Panzer IVs and a Tiger I sitting empty, just 5 kilometers behind their lines. Not destroyed, just out of gas. Meanwhile, every destroyed Sherman was replaced within hours. The radio brought worse news. "Achtung, all units. American fighter bombers approaching from the southwest. All vehicles take cover immediately." Klaus's crew scrambled to camouflage their tank with branches and mud. For the next 20 minutes, they'd hide like rabbits while American P-47 Thunderbolts hunted them with rockets and .50 caliber machine guns. The Americans owned the sky completely. German aircraft were so rare that Klaus hadn't seen a Luftwaffe plane in 2 weeks. American pilots flew multiple sorties daily, attacking anything that moved. They had so many aircraft that losing one barely registered in their daily reports. Major Baker's voice cut through the radio static. "All Bruno units, prepare for withdrawal to secondary positions. We cannot hold against current odds." Secondary positions meant retreating again. They'd been retreating for weeks, always against superior numbers, always with insufficient supplies, always under constant air attack. Klaus looked at his fuel gauge again. Still 1/4 full. Still dropping. He calculated ranges and distances. They had enough fuel for maybe 40 kilometers of combat movement. The Americans, their supply convoys stretched from the beaches to the front lines in unbroken chains of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and replacement vehicles. The growing desperation was becoming impossible to ignore. The moment Klaus Zimmermann truly understood what they were facing came at 13:47 hours on July 11th, when he witnessed something that shattered every assumption about American tank warfare. A single Sherman had been disabled by a Panzerfaust hit to its left track. Standard procedure, the crew would abandon the vehicle, retreating on foot while the tank became a permanent loss. Klaus watched through his periscope, waiting for the Americans to follow doctrine. Instead, an M32 tank recovery vehicle appeared within minutes, not hours, minutes. Hands, Klaus whispered to his gunner. "Are you seeing this?" The American recovery vehicle deployed a winch, lifted the disabled Sherman's front end, and began towing it toward their lines, under fire, with methodical precision that suggested they'd done this hundreds of times before. They're recovering their damaged tanks? Hans's voice carried disbelief. German doctrine accepted that damaged vehicles were losses. The Americans were treating tank recovery like a routine maintenance operation. But it got worse. Much worse. 20 minutes later, Klaus watched a second Sherman take a direct hit from his company commander's Panzer IV. The Sherman's turret armor was penetrated, smoke poured from the crew compartment, and the tank went silent. Textbook kill. Except 30 minutes later, the same Sherman was moving again. Impossible, Klaus muttered, adjusting his optics. But there it was. The Sherman he'd watched die was now advancing with the rest of its unit. Fresh crew, repaired damage, combat ready. Through his radio headset, Klaus heard Major Baker's stunned voice. "Bruno 2, confirm. Did that Sherman did they repair it in the field?" "Confirmed, sir. The Americans have field repair capabilities we don't understand." What Klaus was witnessing was American combined arms doctrine in action. Every American armored division included organic maintenance companies with specialized equipment, trained mechanics, and stockpiles of replacement parts. They could repair battle damage, swap engines, replace transmissions, and return destroyed tanks to combat within hours. Klaus opened his personal diary that night and wrote, "Maria, I begin to understand that we are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting a system. When we destroy one of their tanks, 2 more appear. When we damage one, they repair it while we watch. When we retreat, they advance with fresh tanks full of fuel and ammunition. I do not think we understood what American industry means until now." His loader, young Friedrich, had stopped making jokes about American ice cream rations. He'd started asking questions like, "Herr Obergefreiter, if they can repair tanks that fast, and they have that many spare parts, and they can replace complete crews overnight, how do we win?" Klaus didn't have an answer. The breaking point wasn't tactical, it was psychological. German tankers had been taught to think of each tank as precious, irreplaceable, worth preserving at all costs. American tankers treated tanks like ammunition, consumable resources to be expended in pursuit of objectives. Klaus realized they weren't fighting tank versus tank. They were fighting craftsmanship versus industrial capacity, individual skill versus systematic superiority, German expertise versus American logistics. And the Americans were winning through sheer mathematical inevitability. The revelation spread through German tank units like a contagion of despair. Klaus Zimmermann wasn't alone in his dawning understanding. Across the entire Western Front, veteran panzer crews were reaching the same terrible conclusion. Hauptmann Fritz Fullride, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, radioed his battalion commanders at 0800 hours July 12. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss what we witnessed yesterday. Intelligence reports suggest American tank production exceeds our previous estimates by considerable margins." "How considerable, sir?" came the response from 2nd Battalion. "Conservative estimates indicate Americans are producing more tanks monthly than we produce annually." Radio silence. Then, quietly, "Sir, that cannot be accurate." "I wish it weren't, but the evidence is in front of us. Count the Shermans in your sector, and compare to yesterday's count." Within hours, similar conversations were happening across every German armored unit in Normandy. Company commanders called regiment headquarters. Regiment commanders called division. Division commanders called corps. The pattern was always the same: initial disbelief, followed by a request to recount enemy strength, followed by stunned silence. Oberst Heinrich Eberbach received a report from his intelligence officer that shattered his understanding of industrial warfare. "Sir, based on serial number analysis of captured Sherman components, American production appears to be approximately 1,400 tanks monthly. Current estimates suggest they've produced over 40,000 Shermans since 1942. Eberbach stared at the report. 40,000? That's more tanks than our entire army possessed in 1939. "Yes, sir, and they're still increasing production." The psychological impact cascaded through every level of command. Tank crews who'd been confident became cautious. Cautious crews became defensive. Defensive crews began looking for opportunities to withdraw rather than engage. Klaus heard it in radio communications. Where his company commander used to issue attack orders, Now he issued probe and withdraw instructions. Where battalion headquarters used to demand aggressive action, they now emphasized preservation of combat effectiveness. The language of warfare was changing because the mathematics of warfare had changed. Young Friedrich, Klaus's loader, asked the question that haunted every German tank crew. Herr Obergefreiter, if they can replace every tank we destroy within hours, and we can't replace any tanks we lose, what happens when we run out of tanks? Klaus looked at his 17 remaining armor-piercing rounds and his quarter-full fuel tank. The mathematics were brutally simple. Every engagement depleted German resources while American resources seemed infinite. His radio crackled. All units be advised, enemy strength estimates have been revised upward, substantially upward. What happened next broke their calculations completely. The German response to overwhelming American tank production revealed the desperation of a military machine faced with impossible mathematics. Klaus Zimmermann watched this strategic collapse happen in real time. On July 15th, new orders came down from Army Group B. All panzer units will adopt defensive positions. Offensive operations are suspended indefinitely pending reinforcement. Klaus had never seen defensive orders for panzer units. Tanks were offensive weapons. Defensive panzer orders meant the German army had fundamentally changed its understanding of armored warfare. But the orders got stranger. Priority target: disable. Don't destroy American tanks. Disabling preserves our ammunition for multiple engagements. Klaus read this twice. German doctrine had always emphasized complete destruction of enemy armor. Now they were being told to wound tanks, not kill them, because they couldn't afford the ammunition for clean kills. The technical analysis made this shift inevitable. Klaus's Panzer IV carried 37 rounds of main gun ammunition when fully loaded. A single engagement against American forces might require 12 to 15 rounds, multiple shots per target, because American tanks kept fighting even after being hit. 2 full engagements would exhaust his ammunition completely. Meanwhile, every Sherman carried 71 rounds of main gun ammunition, plus thousands of rounds for their coaxial and bow machine guns. American tanks could fight sustained engagements that would exhaust German ammunition reserves. Major Baker received new tactical instructions that transformed panzer warfare. Engage only when victory is certain. Withdraw when outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Preserve vehicles and crews over territorial objectives. These weren't the orders of an army planning to win, they were the orders of an army planning to survive. The desperate mathematics became clear in supply reports. Klaus's division had started July with 78 operational tanks. After 2 weeks of fighting, they had 31 operational tanks, and no prospect of replacements. American divisions were ending July with more tanks than they'd started with, despite heavy combat. German industry was producing approximately 300 tanks monthly of all types. American industry was producing 1,400 Sherman tanks monthly, plus Stuart light tanks, plus tank destroyers, plus half-tracks, plus all the other armored vehicles Klaus couldn't even identify. The strategic shift wasn't tactical, it was mathematical surrender. German commanders weren't making military decisions anymore, they were making accounting decisions. How long could they preserve their remaining assets? How slowly could they retreat while inflicting maximum casualties per tank lost? Klaus received his most depressing order on July 18th. Abandon damaged vehicles. Recovery operations consume more resources than replacement value. German tanks that could be repaired would be abandoned because Germany couldn't afford the fuel, mechanics, and time required to recover them. The Americans, meanwhile, were recovering tanks that Klaus would have considered total losses and returning them to combat within hours. The final technical analysis came from regiment headquarters. American industrial capacity appears unlimited for practical purposes. German strategy must adapt to this reality. Klaus read that line several times. Unlimited for practical purposes meant Germany had stopped trying to match American production and started trying to survive it. Young Friedrich asked the question that defined the new reality. Herr Obergefreiter, if we're not trying to win anymore, what are we trying to do? Klaus looked across the Norman countryside at seemingly endless formations of Sherman tanks and realized the answer was simple. They were trying to make American victory as expensive as possible. The complete acceptance of American industrial superiority came for Klaus Zimmermann on July 25, 1944, when he witnessed Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, that demonstrated the full scope of what they'd been fighting. At 0940 hours, Klaus's position was overrun, not by tanks, but by the industrial might of an entire continent mobilized for war. Through his periscope, he watched a sight that redefined his understanding of modern warfare: 1,500 American heavy bombers carpet-bombing German positions, followed immediately by 396 medium bombers, followed by 550 fighter bombers, followed by the largest artillery barrage in Western Front history, followed by 3 complete armored divisions advancing in perfect coordination. "Mein Gott," whispered Hans, his gunner. "How many tanks are there?" Klaus tried to count and gave up. Hundreds. Maybe 1,000. Sherman tanks, Stuart light tanks, tank destroyers, half-tracks, armored cars, recovery vehicles, supply trucks, an armored tide that stretched beyond his field of vision. This wasn't a battle anymore. This was American industrial capacity, expressing itself through military force. Klaus's radio crackled with Major Baker's final transmission. "All Bruno units. This is Bruno 6. We are completely outnumbered and outgunned. Individual commanders are authorized to make independent decisions regarding crew survival. It has been an honor serving with you." Klaus understood what that meant. Every German tank crew was being given permission to surrender rather than die uselessly against impossible odds. But Klaus made a different choice. He opened his personal journal and wrote what would become one of the most quoted passages from a German tank crew member: "Maria, today I understand what we have been fighting. Not American soldiers, but American factories. Not American tanks, but American assembly lines. Not American crews, but American industry itself. We were fighting the combined production capacity of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and 100 cities we never heard of. We thought we were fighting tanks. We were fighting mathematics." Young Friedrich, tears streaming down his face, asked, "Herr Obergefreiter, did we ever have a chance?" Klaus looked at his 17 remaining rounds, his quarter tank of fuel, and the endless stream of Sherman tanks advancing through the smoke of the bombardment. The mathematical truth was brutal and complete. Germany had never understood what they were fighting. "Friedrich," Klaus said quietly, "we were fighting individual battles against an industrial system. We thought superior training and better engineering could defeat superior numbers. We were wrong." The psychological transformation was complete. Klaus Zimmermann, veteran of the Eastern Front, holder of the Iron Cross, survivor of Stalingrad, had accepted the fundamental truth of industrial warfare in a contest between craftsmanship and mass production. Mass production wins through simple mathematical inevitability. His final radio transmission, recorded by American intelligence, captured the moment perfectly. "This is Bruno 2. We are abandoning our position. The Americans haven't just defeated us tactically, they've defeated us mathematically. Out." Klaus and his crew surrendered that afternoon to a Sherman tank crew from Ohio, whose tank had been built in Detroit, shipped to Britain, landed in Normandy, and driven into combat by men who'd been farmers and factory workers 6 months earlier. The industrial war was over. America had won it before the first shot was fired. Tom nodded. "We didn't even know how many tanks we had. Supply just kept bringing more. Every morning more Shermans than the day before. You know what haunted me most?" Klaus said in careful English. "Was not that you defeated us. Was that you defeated us so completely, so mathematically." 60 years later, in a small cafe in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, an elderly man named Klaus Zimmermann sat across from Tom Patterson, a former Sherman tank commander from the 4th Armored Division. Both men were in their 80s. Both had grey hair and weathered hands. Both carried the memories of July 1944. "In my diary," Klaus continued, "I wrote that we were fighting your factories, not your soldiers. I think I was correct. The statistics of Sherman tank production tell the story of industrial warfare in its purest form. 49,234 total Sherman tanks produced, delivered faster than Germany could train crews to fight them. Peak production reached 1,400 tanks per month, more than Germany's entire annual production of all armored vehicles combined. But the real number that mattered was simpler. While Germany built 25,937 tanks of all types during the entire war, America built 88,410 tanks of all types, plus 18,620 tank destroyers, plus 41,170 armored personnel carriers, plus hundreds of thousands of other armored vehicles. Klaus Zimmermann understood this in July 1944. We were not fighting a military, we were fighting an economy. The Sherman tank itself wasn't superior to German tanks in direct combat, But Sherman production was superior to German production by margins that made direct combat irrelevant. American industry could afford to lose 3 Shermans for every German tank destroyed and still maintain numerical superiority. Modern military analysts call this systems warfare, the integration of industrial capacity, logistics, training, and tactical doctrine into a unified approach that renders individual weapon comparisons meaningless. The Sherman tank was just one component of American systems warfare. The system won the war. Tom Patterson raised his coffee cup in a toast. To the 49,234. They drank to the memory of industrial warfare in its purest form, when American factories defeated German armies not through superior weapons, but through superior arithmetic. The lesson remains relevant today in modern warfare, as in 1944, victory belongs not to the best individual weapons, but to the best integrated systems. Klaus raised his cup. To the mathematics of war. The German tank crews learned this lesson the hard way, one Sherman at a time, until the mathematics became undeniable. 49,234 Sherman tanks rolled across Europe, not because they were the best tanks, but because they were good enough tanks in impossible quantities. Sometimes, in war as in life, good enough in vast numbers defeats perfect in small quantities. The Sherman tank crews were right to mock German superiority. They weren't fighting tanks versus tanks, they were fighting the combined industrial might of America versus the limited production capacity of Germany. The mathematics were never in doubt.